The North Sea, the 8th of June, 1940. Somewhere in the freezing waters west of Norway, a single British destroyer turned toward the enemy. She was HMS Acasta, an A-class destroyer of just over 1,000 tons, armed with 4.7-inch guns and a set of torpedo tubes that her designers had never intended to use against anything resembling what was now bearing down on her. The ship bearing down on her was the Scharnhorst, a German battleship of 32,000 tons, protected by belt armour 11 inches thick, and armed with 9 11-inch guns capable of throwing a shell weighing over 700 pounds across a distance of more than 15 miles. Beside her ran the Gneisenau, a vessel of identical class and nearly identical power. Acasta's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Charles Glasfurd, had already watched the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious go down. He had already watched the destroyer HMS Ardent, Acasta's sole companion for the past hour, reduced to a wreck and left astern. He had nothing left beside him, nothing behind him, and no realistic prospect of help arriving in time. In 31 minutes, fighting alone against odds that no naval planner would have sanctioned, HMS Acasta changed what happened next. This is how. To understand what Acasta was doing in those waters on the morning of the 8th of June, 1940, it is necessary to understand the situation from which she could not escape. The Norwegian campaign, Britain's attempt to contest Germany's occupation of Norway, had collapsed. The evacuation of Allied forces from Narvik was underway, and the vessels at sea that morning were among the last to clear the Norwegian coast. HMS Glorious was carrying aircraft and aircrew northward and then westward toward home, escorted by the destroyers HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta. Glorious was herself a converted battlecruiser of some 22,500 tons, fast enough under normal circumstances but wholly without offensive capability against surface warships. She carried no radar that could reliably detect the enemy at long range, and the aircraft on her deck, though they represented irreplaceable assets, RAF Hurricanes whose pilots had performed the extraordinary feat of landing on a carrier for the first time in the history of that aircraft, were not armed for anti-shipping strikes. The small group pressed westward, unaware. On paper, the Scharnhorst was everything Acasta was not. On paper, her 9 11-inch guns gave her a broadside weight no destroyer in the Royal Navy could survive at any reasonable range. On paper, her maximum speed of just over 31 knots meant she could run down anything that tried to flee her. On paper, her armor belt, up to 11 inches of Krupp cemented steel along her waterline, rendered every weapon Acasta carried essentially decorative. Her secondary armament alone, 12 5.9-inch guns arranged in twin turrets, exceeded in weight and range what Acasta could bring to bear with her main battery. Even the Gneisenau, holding station nearby, was a vessel of the same class, the same power, and the same near invulnerability to a destroyer's guns. Acasta had been built for fleet work, for screening duties, for laying smoke and delivering torpedo attacks against cruisers in coordinated squadron actions. She had not been built to stand alone against two capital ships in open water. Nobody had built a destroyer for that. And yet here she was. The A-class destroyers were not glamorous ships. Laid down in the late 1920s and completed in the early 1930s, they were workman-like fleet destroyers, designed to fill the Navy's need for capable, affordable escorts at a time when the Treasury was not minded toward extravagance. HMS Acasta herself had been launched in 1929, commissioned shortly afterward, and had spent the intervening decade in the kind of steady, undramatic service that does not generate citations or headlines. She displaced just over 1,000 tons at standard load, made around 35 knots on trials, a figure that degraded with age and hard use, and carried for 4.7-inch guns, a quadruple torpedo mount, and a crew of approximately 145 officers and men. Nothing about her specifications suggested she was prepared for what the 8th of June, 1940 would ask of her. But something about the way she was handled on that day suggested that her crew, at least, had decided to make the question of preparedness irrelevant. When the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau found Glorious shortly after 1600 hours, the range was extreme, beyond 24,000 yards, nearly 14 miles, and the German gunnery was, from the first salvos, dangerously accurate. Glorious took hits within the opening minutes of the action. She was burning. She was done. Ardent moved first, laying smoke and pressing toward the German ships in an effort to buy time for Glorious. She drew the attention of the secondary armament from both capital ships and was methodically destroyed. By the time Ardent was finished as a fighting vessel, Glorious was already gone below the surface, and HMS Acasta was, by every measure that counted, alone. There is a stillness that the historical record sometimes finds in these moments, the stillness of a commanding officer looking at what remains and deciding what to do with it. If you find value in accounts like this one, of the ships and the men who faced impossible circumstances and refused to make the arithmetic their commander, subscribing to this channel means you will not miss the next one. Glasfurd made his decision. He would not run. He would attack. The sequence of events that followed can be reconstructed with reasonable precision. At approximately 1,740 hours, with Acasta now operating alone in increasingly heavy seas and under fire from the guns of both capital ships, Glasfurd turned his ship toward the Scharnhorst and ordered the attack. Acasta laid smoke, the standard practice for a destroyer pressing toward a capital ship, and used that smoke to mask her approach and confuse the enemy's fire control. The German gunners were experienced, and the Scharnhorst's targeting was methodical. Shells from her secondary armament, each weighing in the region of 100 pounds, were falling close. Shells from the primary turrets, at over 700 pounds apiece, raised columns of water that could swamp a destroyer outright if they landed near enough. Acasta came through the smoke. At a range estimated at around 4,000 yards from the Scharnhorst, close enough that the outcome of a direct hit from either side was not in question, Glasfurd fired for torpedoes. The geometry of a torpedo attack against a ship traveling at speed, turning under helm, firing back at you with every gun that could be brought to bear, is one of the most demanding calculations a naval officer can be asked to make in real time. One torpedo struck the Scharnhorst. The hit was aft, near the stern of the ship, below the waterline. It opened a section of the hull to the sea and drove 2,500 tons of water into the Scharnhorst's lower compartments. The flooding forced the ship to reduce speed. It put her port engine out of action. It wounded 48 of her crew and killed a further 3. And it ended, definitively, any immediate German calculation involving a pursuit of the remaining British ships in the area. The Scharnhorst was damaged. She needed a dockyard. She needed Trondheim. She would not be at sea hunting convoys that week. Acasta did not survive the action. She was struck by gunfire from the German ships and began to take on water rapidly. Glasfurd issued the order to abandon ship, and Acasta sank. Of a crew of approximately 145, only one man survived, an able seaman named Carter, who was picked up later and from whose account the final minutes of the action could be pieced together. It was Carter who reported that Glasfurd, in the moments before the ship was lost, had signaled that Acasta had hit the Scharnhorst with a torpedo, a signal that allowed the Admiralty to understand what had happened in those waters even before the full damage to the German ship became known through other intelligence sources. Glasfurd did not survive. He went down with his command. The strategic consequences of what Acasta did on the 8th of June, 1940 were not immediately visible in the press or the public record, because the Norwegian campaign was already over and the fall of France was consuming every column inch available. But the Scharnhorst's withdrawal to Trondheim with a torpedo hole in her stern was not a trivial matter. The damage required 3 months of repair. The Scharnhorst was out of the war until after the threat of German invasion of Britain had passed and the strategic situation in the Atlantic had shifted. The torpedo from a 1,000-ton destroyer, delivered in the final minutes of a fight that the destroyer was already losing, denied the German naval staff the use of a capital ship during one of the most critical periods of the entire war. The loss of HMS Glorious, HMS Ardent, and HMS Acasta was grievous. More than 1,500 men died in those waters on the 8th of June, 1940, most of them from Glorious, many of them because the distress signal sent during the action took too long to reach ships that might have intervened. The Admiralty inquiry into the episode raised difficult questions about the disposition of Glorious and the failure of the escort to include heavier surface units. These were valid questions, and the answers that came back were uncomfortable ones. But the record of what Acasta did in the final phase of that action was entered clearly and without ambiguity. She was a ship that had been given an impossible task in the worst possible circumstances, already abandoned by the larger course of events, already alone, and she had completed it. 31 minutes. 1 torpedo. 1 hit. 3 months removed from the war's most dangerous capital ship. The crew of Acasta, those 145 men, most of whose names are recorded on memorials in the United Kingdom because they have no other grave, had answered the question of what a ship does when there is nothing left to do but fight. They had answered it with a clarity that required no elaboration at the time and requires none now. Lieutenant Commander Charles Glasfurd was mentioned in dispatches. It was, given everything, a modest official acknowledgement of what he had done. His ship had been outgunned by a factor that defies easy expression, outweighed by a margin of more than 30-1, and outranged at every point in the engagement except the final, close-quarters approach that cost him his life and the lives of nearly all his men. He closed the range anyway. On the morning of the 8th of June, 1940, a single British destroyer turned toward 2 German capital ships in the North Sea, and the arithmetic said she should not have been there. She was the last escort, the last hull afloat, the last thing standing between the enemy and the absence of any consequence at all. She had been built for fleet work, not for this. She had been designed for a navy that planned its engagements in squadrons, not in solitude. Every officer and rating aboard her understood, with the clarity that comes from watching the ship ahead of you go under, exactly what they were sailing into. They were orphaned by the loss of Glorious, orphaned by the sinking of Ardent, orphaned by the collapse of the campaign that had brought them to these waters in the first place, a ship alone with her crew and a decision. Acasta was never anything other than a modest fleet destroyer. But for 31 minutes, fighting on her own against the Scharnhorst, she was something that nobody who planned or built or doubted her had ever drawn on a specification sheet. She was enough. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to be here for the next ship story, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the simplest way to make sure you don't miss it.